Welcome to Bat Therapy, mental health through the lens of comics and film. Be a fly on the wall or a bat in the cave, listening in on a friendship built out of a love for talking Batman, comics, and the everyday struggle to achieve mental health and happiness.
We are your hosts, clinical psychologist Dr. Amelia Brown and educator and comic aficionado Keeden Hopkins. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube and social media and find our Patreon at patreon.com/battherapy.
This podcast is about providing education and understanding and is not a replacement for mental health treatment or support. If you're needing help, go to bat-therapy.com for resources. So today I'm excited to bring another friend onto the podcast because it's our podcast. We can do what we want. So I do this from time to time. So we have Dr. Sasha Jaquez here. She is a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Dell Medical School. She's also director of the psychology training program over at Dell Medical School and is board certified in clinical health psychology. Has over 10 years of experience working as a licensed psychologist with children and young adults. So she, in particular, tends to focus in on where medicine or the medical and mental health diagnoses tend to intersect. So we're very excited to have Sasha here with us today. The reason that we brought Sasha was so Keeden, you and I were chatting, right, about Avengers Doomsday. And Keeden was like, you know what I'm really tired of is not having the Young Avengers, right?
Yes.
So you were who are some of the people that have been popping up from the Young Avengers that you were talking about?
So there's been a lot of characters throughout all of these movies, throughout the TV shows that keep introducing characters that if you're familiar with the comic books at all, you know, like these are characters that eventually will become members of the Young Avengers. So Billy or Wiccan is Scarlet Witch's little boy. He has a brother, but they've mentioned him, but he hasn't officially been brought back into the fold yet. You see him a little bit in WandaVision. You have Eli Bradley, who is Isaiah Bradley's grandson, who
I totally forgot they showed.
Yeah, he's shown up. We have Kate Bishop as a new Hawkeye, a lot younger. We have America Chavez, who pops into
the terrible movie.
Multiverse of Madness, not my favorite, right?
Not a great movie, but hey, if we can get a good character out of it, that's good.
Yes. And then, of course, we love Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel.
Best.
Yes, she's popped up. And then, of course, in the last Ant-Man movie, Cassie Lang, she ended up with her own suit and her own powers. As far as superheroes go, she has pretty much the same power set as her dad. And then, of course, there's Riri Williams, who popped into Wakanda Forever and then also got her own miniseries. And so the thing about it is they've introduced all of these characters. And I was really excited about it because I'm like, okay, eventually I know they're definitely going to make this happen. They're definitely going to do this. But there hasn't been any announcement for it. And it's frustrating because we've seen these adult superhero teams and how they interact with each other and the different issues that they face and their past turmoils. But we haven't seen them do a team of young superheroes. In DC, we've seen it, of course, with like the Teen Titans, and Young Justice, things like that. But I was really hoping we would finally get a live action version of that. And they've kept alluding to it and teasing us with it.
So we're hoping they'll show us something.
So we're hoping that they will show us something. But the original idea, I was thinking about it. I was like, well, it would be interesting if we were able to find someone that was an expert when it comes to children.
Yeah, which is not me.
Right.
Nope.
Yeah.
No.
Well, and I was thinking about it as a educator, how if I'm dealing with an adult versus a child, things are incredibly different as far as how I approach things, how I introduce things, the amount of patience that you have to have and things. And so I talked to Amelia and I was like, what if we could find someone that works with children to come on and talk about some of those differences that you would have anytime you're approaching a child versus when we've talked multiple times about adults on this podcast. And so thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me. Super excited to chat about it.
Yeah. And so I will go ahead and spill your secret here. Sasha's not into comics and superheroes and all that stuff. And we still invited her because she's a cool person who knows what she's talking about. So I think though that that is going to be really interesting because you can look at these characters without being biased about all of this other background and stuff and we can purely focus in on the psychology, which I think is really cool with this stuff. So it's funny because when I asked you to come on the podcast, and I was like, here's how this whole question of a child psychologist came up. I said, Keeden wants to know the difference between therapy with children and adults. And you were like, I don't, is there? I don't know. And I was like, great question. I don't know. So you had an adult psychologist and child psychologist say like, I don't know. So like, Sasha, from your sense of things, like, is there a big difference in what you do versus what I do with adults?
I'm glad I had a little bit of time to think about it because I think yes and no is going to be my answer. Probably what really sets me apart and what can be the challenge, but also the really exciting part of my day is depending on the age of the child, but also their developmental level, I might approach them differently. So with an adult, I can just have a conversation. I can speak and I don't have to be as thoughtful. Was that too big of a word? Do they understand what I'm saying? Am I losing them in what I'm talking about? Or if I'm trying to teach a skill, then I oftentimes have to think more developmentally or what are their strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes in my job, we know that they might have like a verbal strength. And so I can do things more verbally versus like maybe they have a verbal weakness. So I need to do things more hands-on activities. So I think that that's probably one of the primary things is having to take that developmental approach to what we're doing. And it can look very different for a young child versus like an adolescent. I think the other thing is adolescents and kids, I always am still interacting with the parent.
Mm.
I have to get consent from parents, and oftentimes I have to make sure that the kids are telling me accurately what's going on. And I do have some older teens that parents aren't as involved, but that's really like closer to young adult. But there is that component still where the patient might be or the client might be the child, but I'm still interacting pretty frequently with the parents, which is going to be different from adults who you don't always have to include anybody else in their care.
Yeah, I feel like you come across that developmental question with adults, but it's funny because your age range, I would assume, is like what, age 4 to 6 or something to like 18ish,
Yeah.
probably. Yeah. And so, like, I'm like 18 till forever,
Yes.
whenever they keel over and die. Right. So, I had it. I think I've had at least just one person in their 90s. I think. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. And so, the funny thing is, so my age range is obviously way bigger,
Much larger.
but there's so much development happening in the smaller age range that you're dealing with. Because you were talking about a difference of 5 or 10 years can
Mhm.
be huge in how you respond. Versus for me, like if I'm dealing with a 20-year-old versus a 75-year-old, there's definitely going to be things that I approach differently. And there are going to be things I keep in mind in terms of, well, first off, the 18-year-old, their brain isn't fully developed. So they're going to be a little more impulsive,
Mhm.
but also developmentally, like where they're at and what they're focusing on in life. So I'm gonna adjust, but it's so funny, like, my age swatch is so much bigger, but yours has so many more changes in it, I feel
Mhm.
like.
Yeah. And I think that that's also part of it is I don't work with fully developed brains at all. None of my patients have fully developed brains and I think that can be a challenge in some situations, but I think that it can also be really adaptive in some situations because I know that their brain's not developed. So I can teach them a skill. We can wait a little while. I can reteach it because they're continuing to learn. And I find that kids are very, very resilient, which I think is something that is really nice about my job is I know I can try again later because still developing and they're still learning and they're still open to learning. For them.
That's a really good point. And one thing that it does make me think about when you talk about resilience is I was thinking about how with Amelia and her talking about her patients, like they're all adults and they all have that thing in common. Like for the most part, she works with, is it all veterans that you pretty much?
Me?
Yes.
Currently, yes. Yeah,
Yes.
for a long time, I've only worked with veterans.
With veterans. Yeah. And that's something that I think they have, like, that's something that I feel like they all share, like, in common. Like, if they're all in a
Mhm.
waiting room, they all have, like, something that they're familiar with about each other. And a lot of the times it is the same way with children. But as you said, it can be completely different 5 years, 10 years apart because it's essentially dealing with an elementary schooler, a middle schooler, and a high schooler. Three completely different approaches, right? Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And I think that that is part of the challenge that is fun is looking at the age on the chart. So how old does it say they are? And then how do they interact too? Because I work with a lot of kids that have medical illnesses, and so they have been with a lot of adults and interacting at a pretty high level. And oftentimes, some of those kids don't present that age because they're just used to interacting with adults. But then, how do they interact with children? So sometimes we almost make them grow up too fast because there's so many interactions within the medical system and they're learning really, really big words related to their medical care, but then they don't know like how to do some of the most simple things that would be age appropriate because maybe they've lost some of that opportunity to learn within a specific developmental age.
So
That
I
was a
feel like that
window.
can specifically tie to the Young Avengers. Because one of the things that I found myself thinking about was, okay, so what are the effects of being a superhero and being plopped into that world, which I think is similar to, okay, you're plopped into the medical world and you're surrounded by all these adults. Okay, you're plopped into the superhero world where there are all these theoretically very high functioning adults, but specifically related to being a superhero. I'm not saying that they're like great at the other stuff, but how would that affect your childhood development? You're around all that stuff. There's battles and wars, and you're seeing the ugly stuff in life, and you're just seeing all the dark stuff, really. I feel like it would be a similar thing where they're probably growing up very quickly, but like you said, in some ways it might be rushing the process, so you miss some things.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think also missing some of the key aspects, like what I think of a lot is, we're always assessing school and how is school going and what do grades look like and if they're sick and they have to be pulled out of school socially. I think a lot of people are like, well, yeah, you want them to get caught up academically, and that's actually a lot easier to catch them up. Like we can do tutoring, we can have them repeat a grade, but from a social aspect, like did they learn how to share? Did they learn how to engage in pretend play with other people? Sometimes I see kids that only want to do their pretend play. Like they don't want to engage with anybody else. And if you don't do it the way I want you to do it, and those are all developmentally things that you're learning as a child. But if you get sick or you find out you're a superhero like at a specific time, you might skip some of those developmentally appropriate kind of milestones that we would expect.
God, can you imagine just to say like someone who's got like super strength and they don't know how to shake or they don't
Right.
know how to.
They don't have to.
Yeah. Well, it's like they never learned like, oh hey, my way is not the only way. That's a little terrifying to be
Yeah. I mean,
honest.
I'm an only child and I feel familiar with some of these things that she says. So I'm like, oh my gosh. Like, yeah, like, oh wow. Okay, that explains some things right there. And it essentially, like with a lot of these characters that I was mentioning before, a lot of them went through things that more or less forced them to grow up either very quickly or very differently. And I say different as in like something traumatic happened because I mean, we see all kinds of families now. Like there's no such thing as normal childhood versus a non-normal, right? Because it's just basically the life that we live essentially. But specifically with these superheroes, it's something that happened extraordinary, right? Something supernatural or some technological breakthrough or whatever it may be that caused them to either have powers of some kind, either become incredibly skilled at something, or just basically have to survive by themselves because of a traumatic event. And whenever we talk on this podcast about characters, huge majority of the time, they're adults. And it's like, okay, if they were sitting in the therapy seat, how would you approach this? Because this is a grown up that has been through things that are honestly quite set in their ways, know what they're dealing with. And a lot of the times it's one of those things where it's a push and tug kind of situation. And after hearing you talk about children at the beginning of this episode, it sounds like a lot of those things are very similar. But when it comes to that undeveloped mind, what kind of different approaches do you think you have to take when dealing with a child versus an adult?
I mean, I think the thing that makes it challenging is that when trauma interacts at any point, it can rewire the brain. I think when your brain's not fully formed, though, you can be more susceptible to that. So there's research that talks about like in utero trauma. So the baby in utero can be impacted by trauma that the mom is experiencing. And so I think that it is so it's hard to know, but whenever you have that developing brain at any age of childhood, there is an expectation that that could at some point rewire. And it might be that they learn really adaptive coping skills. So I don't want to say that it's always, if you experience trauma, it's always going to be a negative reaction, but we have to be thoughtful about what is the experience and how did it impact you. I did research in graduate school on traumatic events in children that had experienced natural disasters. And it was just really interesting. You know, it's a natural disaster. There is no reason that it happened outside. It's what the weather. It's super random. But some of the kids thought that it was their fault and they had experienced these traumas before, but they were like, well, I caused the tornado to happen. So the trauma was like rewiring kind of their attributions, and maybe they had been bad that day. And so they were really feeling like it was their fault that these things happened. And so
Mhm.
I think there's just so many ways that this can play out in kids, and sometimes we might never even know, or sometimes it might be really obvious, and that can also be tricky, is that it's not always like one size fits all, or like, oh, because your behavior is doing this, we know that this was a trauma that you experienced.
Yeah. This is making me wonder too. So a lot of people that I work with are they have some very stuck behaviors. They're having trouble functioning from day to day because their symptoms are so severe. And one of the really common things that comes up is not being able to trust other people, not being able to trust the world. I've been beat down by people, by things that have gone on for so long, and no one helped, or very few people helped, or it's just I was thinking about the resiliency you were talking about earlier, and there's so plasticity. The brain is still growing, and it is able to rebound better and rewire in a different way if it needs to, and all that stuff. And so I'm wondering also, some of those things that can get stuck with trauma or all of that chaos of the world and everything that builds up and gets so solidified in adulthood. I can't help but wonder, if you're lucky enough to catch it at these younger ages, they're not going to be an adult that says everyone was terrible. At the very least, Sasha was there, or Keeden the teacher, or, if someone catches it and can work with them with it. I'm wondering if like some of those stuck points and pieces that you have in adulthood, do they seem more workable with younger children?
Yeah. And I actually think, Amelia, that you're on to a very important key point. And by saying this, I one day might not be able to have a job. But I think that the goal of mental health too, at least like within like pediatric psychology, is we're trying to be more proactive.
Mm,
So instead, I think mental health generally is a reactive field. Like, okay, now we have diagnosed depression, we have diagnosed anxiety, ADHD, trauma. And now it's like, so what do we do with that? And I think that there really is an opportunity to be more proactive and being embedded in the medical clinics that I'm in. I talk all the time, like, as soon as they start to struggle with coping, get me involved. I don't need a diagnosis. I don't need it to be depression or anxiety. I want to teach skills at the offset as soon as we start to see some difficulties so that we don't actually get to that point of
nice.
difficulties functioning.
Yeah.
And so I think that, my hope would be that we can shift into more of a proactive kind of approach versus like the reactive mental health approach that is what we know it. Obviously, there's lots of challenges related, but I am in an area where I have seen the sooner that they get psychology involved and that we're able to teach some of those skills, actually, the better the outcomes can be because we're giving them what they need and we're not waiting for it to be a problem.
So proactively, if you had a group of kids who had special abilities and superpowers and they formed a team and they're fighting aliens and battles and all this stuff. So proactively, are there things that you would be thinking about like, hey, if I was a psychologist that was like a touch point for this team, here are things that I would want to make sure that they were doing psychologically?
I mean, first sign me up because that sounds really cool.
I know, right?
Like, does that job exist? I'd love it. I mean, I think one of the things is honestly just acknowledging it because if they have these super powers and they have things that set them apart, I think that they could be at increased risk for like being bullied if they're among the folks that don't have those types of powers. So I think just having the conversation about like what makes you different and how it's okay to be different. In one of my clinics, I work with kids that have skin differences, and everybody, like, our hair is different colors, our eyes, our skin is different. Like, really trying to empower. It doesn't define who you are. Like, what are the defining features of who you are? And it's often not that. So I think I try to work with them to for that not to be the defining factor because I think that that could be a challenge if their only defining factor and kind of their whole character is built around, the one superpower that they had. Because what happens if that superpower were to go away or it were to change? I think that that could really rock a child
Yeah.
who is trying to like figure out who they are just generally. But I think also, making sure that they have some social skills and they know how to interact with other people because they might stand out in not as great ways with these with these talents. And so also being in control. So what are they in control of? And can they learn to control this versus does it come out of their control? I think that's something I work with a lot with kids because they want to control everything around them, but when something is uncontrollable, we can only control ourselves and we can control our behaviors and the way that we think about things, but we can't control anything else. So identifying what is within their control so that they feel a little bit better and have more autonomy.
Talking about this, the more I realize like this would be a really great TV show.
Yeah,
Just,
it would.
like taking one of these teams and being like,
It would
okay, let's give
be great.
them a child adolescent psychologist to help them strategize and decompress and
Yeah.
process what's going on
Well,
and proactively like work on things. And
and going
Let's do it.
on that subject a bit, I think that's why the X-Men are so great, right?
uh-huh.
A lot of them
Yeah.
the X-Men were a lot of them essentially children that came into this school. All the kids at this school had powers like them, and they had Professor Charles Xavier there who had them in weekly sessions solo while they were attending school, while they had a very safe space.
He was a telepath, so some questions of like ethical nature, Sasha just said. So,
Right,
but
right.
he fortunately a good guy,
But at
so
the
he
same
wasn't
time,
taking
yeah.
advantage of the.
And he was able to kind of, and there were so many times he could delve in and like look at things that happened. I know, Sasha, you were mentioning how you're constantly trying to make sure that they're telling the full story or telling the whole truth. And I feel like Xavier, like a lot of times he would be the one, he's like, all right, let me actually see
Mhm.
what's going on here or what
Yeah.
happened. But with the Young Avengers, these are characters who don't have a Charles Xavier, who don't have that. And so one of the
Well,
things I
and
was, yeah,
a lot of them too, like their parental figures are also quirky people living
mhm,
quirky lives.
right. Like, I mean, Kate Bishop, she essentially, once she lost her father at a very young age and essentially had to, her mom was there, but she ended up being more of the parent figure than the mom. The mom was, I think I think the term like parentification.
Hmm.
I think it's a term I've heard used in like education before whenever students were having issues with things where she was essentially just forced to grow up, and not just in the sense of this is what grief is and I have to learn how to deal with it. This is what trauma is and I have to learn how to deal with it. But also being the most functional person in the household, even though she is the youngest.
Hmm.
And one of the things that's really interesting about that is when it comes to dealing with adults versus dealing with children, a lot of the times these you're walking them through this for the very first time at a young age. Like, and I was sitting there because my first thought was grief. Like, there's like a running joke in the comic book community. Like, if you're the main protagonist of a comic book, your parents are in trouble because so many times they end up being orphaned or they had a bad
Hmm.
childhood or their parents might be incarcerated or different things like that.
That origin
And
story tends to be brutal.
it's
Yeah.
always a brutal origin story, right? Like, even if we're looking at like Star Wars, like it's always just a rough origin story or the hero's journey, if you will. And so I do find it fascinating because a lot of the times the children that you are working with, you're walking them through it for the very first time.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that that's a good point, and something I generally try to ask is like, how have you coped with this in the past, or how have you coped with hard things in the past? And sometimes I get a good answer, and that gives me an assessment of coping skills. And are we more? Do we have more adaptive coping skills, or do we have more maladaptive coping skills? Because a coping skill is still a coping skill. It just might not be super helpful. But sometimes it's like I've never had any adverse interaction with anything. Like life's been pretty great up until this point. And I think that that's where the resilience comes in. And like I could derail this a whole lot, but I think that it's really important, even thinking of education. Like something I said very recently is everyone has to learn how to fail. Like we're going to
Mm.
fail. We've all failed something. But I think when somebody has never had that experience, the failure hurts even more. And if they have been good at literally everything that they've ever tried, like that's in the moment, that might feel good and that might be perceived as a good thing, but it's actually not because that's not real life. Like there's going to be failure. You're talking about like really big grief, like with the loss of loved ones or changes, but even like having to move to a new school, like you're still going to grieve like the house that you have to leave and the friends that you have to leave. So even though those are like little griefs, like that's all things that can really lead to coping skills moving forward. And how did you deal with that? Did you just pretend it didn't happen? Did you take what was within your control and celebrate that? So I think that there's so much here.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point with a lot of these characters where you have this obvious strength. I mean, even the ones that aren't technically superpowered, like Riri Williams is just very intelligent.
Mhm.
And so you have these characters have really honed skills or superpowers of some sort. I could definitely see that being a part where and for them, stakes are huge. So, a mistake could be something where lives are involved. Kind of like how we were talking about growing up too fast. Like talk about growing up too fast, where they probably have control in situations that it's like, I mean, like, is this the best thing for you at this age? Like ideally, is there an adult who could do this instead, kind of thing. But because of the powers or the abilities they have. So I could see that tension of not wanting to fail or not struggling to tolerate not being able to do things completely perfectly or the way that they want to being really tricky. And then I'm also like I can't help but wonder about their siblings. Some of them have siblings who aren't superpowered or super able. So then I think
Yeah,
about them.
right.
So what would you do for their siblings?
I would offer the same support because I think that siblings get lost a lot and they're like, "Oh,
Mm,
it's not happening to them, like they're fine or they don't have the superpower, so they're considered normal." But I think seeing somebody else get all of the attention can be very detrimental. So I do think that the siblings would need their own support for being the sibling of someone with a superpower.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because I
and
actually think, sorry,
no, go ahead, please.
I think siblings are also more likely to suffer in silence. And so then we could actually start to see some of those more like diagnosable disorders like internalizing depression or anxiety that when there's behaviors and outbursts, that's very visual and you can kind of pinpoint that. But I think when they start to have those internalizing disorders, it's a little bit harder to identify. And the first symptoms might be like all of a sudden an A student is a C student where and we might not really pick up on it for a little while, or maybe they're not engaged in the extracurriculars that they used to be, but they're really not telling us. So I think that there has to be that awareness of the flags that you're looking for because they're probably going to be pretty quiet about it.
It really reminds me of like when I used to be I was a former science chair at an early college. And so my whole job was to take high school students and get them prepared to take college level courses. And every year there was always that very first test that I gave. There was always that very first test. And there would be so many students there where it was the first time they ever didn't get an A or they got a bad grade on something. And it was a whole process. I had like a whole plan of action like, okay, let's talk about why this happened. Let's talk about why this is okay. Let's look at historically people that did very amazing things but definitely failed, right? And walking them through that process. And as y'all were talking, it just kind of reminded me like, wow, I have done something, I guess, very similar to it, just kind of walking them through like, okay, you got a bad grade, but it does happen. I know that it strangely is just now happening to you at the age of 14, but it does happen. Right. And I guess that same thing can go with things like grief or with things like depression. And it's just walking. And I think it's just very important what you do because it's not only helping them deal with it, but also kind of defining it for them. Like as somebody that
Hmm.
suffered from depression, I had that as a child and I had no idea why. I had no idea what was wrong. I was like, why am I unhappy? I have food. I'm in front of a TV. I have the new video game I want. Why am I sad? Like, and I remember just not understanding that, but also keeping it to myself out of fear of like being some like my mom thinking I was unappreciative, right? Like I'm like,
Hmm.
no, 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 I'm gonna be quiet. Like I don't know what's going on here. And so that it's so fascinating because yeah, like I said, you're essentially teaching them and at the same time helping them and like showing them these mechanisms, and like you said, helping these children become very functioning and successful adults because they're learning these things at a young age and learning how to deal with it versus walking into Amelia's office after 3 or 4 deployments.
Mhm.
Let me
And
tell you,
yeah,
trying to convince a 60-year-old to change how they cope with stuff, even though they know how they're coping right now isn't working, just because what you're doing right now isn't working doesn't mean change isn't really uncomfortable.
Mhm.
So I totally agree. Like, I love what I do, and I love just stubbornly keep helping someone chip away and make those shifts. But we get rigid, man. Like, I mean, there are certain things that are innate to who you are, but there are so many things that we can ebb and tweak. And the funny thing about routine and regularity is you're not even aware of so many things, and you're not necessarily continuing to do it because it works for you the best. It's just like you're doing it because that's how you've been doing it.
Mhm.
And it's so funny how many things are like that. And yeah, Keaton, you're so right. Like someone coming into my office, I mean, like I'm speaking for you, I guess, Sasha, but like, I mean, if you've been doing something for decades or maybe even half a century versus you've been doing it for a few years, plus your brain is still making connections and things. It's like in the learning phase, it's like soaking things up like a sponge. It'd be so great if all of these people I was seeing, we could catch up back then.
Yeah. When I think that that's, in a simplistic way, like part of my job is getting comfortable being uncomfortable. Like you're not seeing me if everything's perfect. You're going to maybe see someone like me in the future if everything's going perfect. But like part of my job is making, like, is it working? If it's not working, how can we be uncomfortable and feel good about it and try something new? Because it's that trying something new that is going to lead to change, but it's going to be that uncomfortable feeling that often stops. As soon as we get uncomfortable, we just kind of resort back to, well, at least I know it's not going to work, but I still feel more comfortable knowing
Still
it's not
know
going to
it.
work than trying something
Yep.
I don't know.
Yep.
And that can rewire. I mean, at this younger age, like I might not teach them all of the good coping skills, but at least they can be comfortable feeling uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And I love when a kid is like, or a teenager is like, I hear you in the back of my head talking and telling me to do something new. And I'm like, that's all I need. That's all I want for you. And even if you didn't do it, at least you heard the voice that was like,
Yep.
you could try something
Yep.
new.
I once had a client I worked with, and we talked about having their little therapist me in their little side
Mm,
pocket,
yes.
just telling them things when they
Telling
needed to
them
hear it.
things. Yes.
Yeah, and sometimes that voice has to come from outside of yourself at first, and I mean, ideally, it eventually becomes, like, a part of their own way of talking to themselves, but, yeah, I totally agree with you. I've joked on here before, like, sometimes I sound kinda sadistic because I'm here to push you out of your comfort zone, and honestly, like, in my head, when I get someone there and I can see that there's, like, an agitation there, I'm like, "Yes, we're getting that sweet spot that we need to get to see a shift." So it's funny that,
Mhm.
you see it in kids too.
When I think the perception of therapy, at least like what people generally say after they've watched a TV show, they're like, oh, this isn't like they think I'm going to tell them what to do. And
Yeah,
I'm like, I'm
yeah.
not going to tell you anything about what to do because I don't actually know what's best. I'm going to challenge you and encourage you to think for yourself and then to make a decision. And I think that is something too that I think can be really helpful is feeling comfortable that and kind of owning what
Yeah,
comes out of therapy.
yeah.
one other thing, and I thought about as you all were talking, that I could just like, I keep forgetting, oh yeah, I'm supposed to talk too, because I could just sit here and listen to you two. I'm just like zoned out. I was about to like go grab a cup of coffee. My headphones are wireless. I'm like, I'm gonna just do the thing. I could just soak it in. This is my favorite. This is my favorite thing. But one of the things I did notice, specifically when it comes to the Young Avengers, because with adult superheroes or with adults like going through therapy, we talked so many times, Amelia, on the podcast about support groups and how much they can help. One thing with the Young Avengers that if they did do it and with their past origins that is interesting is it's more of a support group because when we look at adult superhero teams, they basically came together because there was a huge threat
True.
to
Yeah.
humanity and they had to do that and team up in order to save the day. A lot of the times when you see these young superhero teams, whether it's the Young Avengers or the Teen Titans or even the X-Men, they ended up together because they gravitated toward each other simply to survive or because, hey, these are other people who also understand
They live in the life.
what I've been through. And so I do think that that is very interesting because like just them forming a team and how it formed, I think could come off as a lot better than these other people who, like you said, Amelia, are very set in their ways and now have to work together.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And it's making me think of, Sasha, you were talking before about people always worry about the academics, but that's the easy part. It's the socialization. That's the harder part. And so I think that's a really great point, Keeden. I almost wonder if it's that natural need for that social connection and to be part of a community drawing them together when it comes to the like younger, the like teen groups.
Well, and I think there's a lot of theories that back that up, like social learning theory. We can learn from watching and modeling. Like we learn from doing, we model, or we can model for other people, and then they kind of mimic our behavior. So I think that there's lots of theories that support that.
I did have one other question because a lot of these characters, as I said before, they get put into these situations where they more or less are forced to grow up. Whenever that happens, is there ever a situation where you say, okay, I know there's some situation where it's like, wow, they were forced to grow up early. Let me help them deal with it. Are there ever some times where you're like, yeah, that happened to you, but let's try and backtrack so that you can still have this childhood experience, that you can still have this, like that happened to you, but let's let that be a one and done thing versus a now you know how to survive in this cold world or whatever that. And I'm speaking in comic book terms now, but is there ever a time where you say, okay, yes, that happened, but let's backtrack and see if we can get you back to this childlike state?
Yes. Yes. And I think that that is my ultimate goal. Like whenever I see, like I work with a lot of kids who have cancer, and so it can really shift and change and rock worlds. And my favorite sessions are when a teenager comes in and tells me about their boyfriend or prom or, a fight they had with their best friend. And I get to say, and that's what a normal teenager is doing right now. And so we really work to not be defined by all of that trauma, but for that to be a part, that to be a chapter of the book, but that to not be the whole book. And so those are my absolute favorite things, is when it sounds like the simplest piece and their perspectives might be very different. I have kids that we can have some pretty dark jokes because they've been through a lot, but like they're having a rough time. And I'm like, yeah, but do you remember that time you tried to die on us? Like, you got through that. So like we can totally get through this like really uncomfortable situation with like this crush that you have at school.
I guess that does put things in perspective. Oh, at such a young age. But
Yeah.
I mean, I guess also hopeful. Yeah, like live life. You might as well.
Right. And that's our ultimate goal, really, Keeden, is to get back to, yes, this thing happened. And the goal is you're 15. Like, what are 15-year-olds doing? And that's what we want you to be doing. It might be with a different perspective. It might be in a different way, but 100%, I'm never going to want somebody to have to completely have grown up too fast.
Yeah, I am a little jealous of that piece, I have to say. So a big part of what I do too, just to loop back around to how similar things can be, is I mean, I work with people where the emphasis is quality of life. I mean, you've got so many things weighing down on you from your mental health and probably other stuff that if you don't have a reason to get up in the morning, you're not going to get up in the morning. Like, what do you want out of life? How do you want to live it? And, one of the big struggles that I find, even if people, I'm even talking about like 30s, this can happen for people who are in that age range, even. But there's so much we were talking about grief earlier, grief related to what could have been and the lost years that I'm sure also can happen, Sasha, for your folks, especially like when you've only lived 15 years, 1 year feels like forever. So like, I'm not saying it doesn't happen at that point, but it's just so heartbreaking and raw to like try. Growth comes at a cost because this is possible, and therefore feeling like there was time wasted or, what if. So I'm definitely jealous of that for the people I work with. I wish they could have that perspective of like, I'm 15. What the potential and I'm sure some of the folks you work with might be terminal, where then it's a different story, but yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah. I think it's also special because, we're, for the most part, like, adulthood is much longer. And so also encouraging them to enjoy the childhood that they have. Cause I mean, I'll be honest, like, growing up is the stupidest thing I've ever done. Like, I wish I was 5 years old and like fighting about not taking a nap because all I want to do is nap now. But I think like it's also like we know whatever space that is, whether that's like elementary school or middle school or high school, like it is very time limited versus adulthood is time limited, but it's not as clearly defined as like some of
Yeah.
the areas that I work in. And so, okay, so middle school did not go well for you, but it's only a couple years. Like, what can we look forward to? Because it's going to end. And we know it's going to end and something even greater can happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's one of the things that I like do recognize about this particular superhero team is a lot of their backstories are still things that happen to everyone. And then there's powers in addition to it. Because, I mean, with Billy Wiccan, he's going through a lot of identity confusion and also dealing with grief. I know you were talking about was it intrauterine trauma? Is that what you called it? And I know thinking about Eli Bradley, like there was generational trauma there from how his grandfather basically experienced a whole lot of racism, and he basically learned about this history as he grew up. There's some other characters in there who either had parents that ended up being villains or parents that ended up being incarcerated. And then in addition to that, just some of them just have survival guilt from things that happened to them. And so all of these are very, very real, like real things that happen. It's just and that's one of the things I love about comic books. It's like, yeah, this is a situation that happens on the ground every day to people, but we're putting it on this huge, huge spectacle. Like, yes, but this happened in outer space, or this happened in a secret universe, or this happened during a giant fight against aliens. But at the same time, grief is still grief, trauma is still trauma, loss is still loss. And so I do think it's so fascinating when we get to talk about it and kind of break things down. And I love just listening to you talk about how resilient kids are, because that's what ends up happening a lot of times in these comic books, in these movies, whenever you have children with these incredible abilities. Most of these movies and TV shows, the key is how resilient they are for their age, and them learning to basically navigate this world where the heroes that they thought were perfect, all of a sudden they're on the same level as them, and also seeing that they're not perfect, that these are still just people. And I mean, I think we've all dealt with that. Like, even when like growing up, we realize like, wait, I don't think my parent is perfect. I think they make mistakes,
Hmm.
right? Being a parent, I feel it all the time. And I just think it's so interesting just hearing you two talk about these problems and look at these characters that essentially are dealing with the same thing that your patients are dealing with.
I think I have one last question on my end that I'm curious about that was just occurring to me as we're talking about this stuff. And, Keaton, you were talking about all of these different facets of being superheroes and whatnot. And one of the things that within the current like TV shows, movies, whatnot, there was a period of time called the snap where half of the population of everything disappeared, ceased to exist. Like you had memories of them, but they just like poof were gone. And then they fixed it 5 years later and those people came back. So half of the world continued to live for 5 years.
Yeah, they more or less died. The other
While,
half. Yeah.
while grieving the other ones and complete changes of everything. And then 5 years later, the other people, poof, come back suddenly. They're the
Same
same age
age.
they were 5 years before, right? So there's this like really interesting thing. And so, I don't think we've really thought about that and the interplay with these kids. So some of these kids might have been snapped where they were gone and then they come back and like people have been living half the people they know are 5 years older. And then some of them lived and then like poof, people are coming back again. And it made me think of like real life things with like COVID, where, I mean,
Hmm.
obviously a different scenario, but things shutting down for long chunks of time that we never envisioned happening. And I guess I'm curious what you think these types of situations are like for kids and adolescents, and like how does it affect them developmentally, and like how do they maneuver this kind of thing? Because I mean, once again, a year, 5 years, whatever, I mean, that's a lot to me, but perspective wise, a lot less of my life proportionally compared to like a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that that's a really good question. I don't think I'm going to have a great answer, but the whole time you were talking, I was thinking of COVID because I think that we have learned a lot and good things, but also bad things. And I think that we're really starting to figure out like what was lost during COVID whenever our kids were doing online school and even like learning how to engage. Like, I think it's been really interesting during COVID. Prior to COVID, I actually tried to shift to some virtual visits and we could not figure it out. It was impossible. COVID hit 100 for virtual. And then coming out of COVID, I think a lot of stuff was still virtual. And now I would say most of the people have actually shifted. Like, I want interactions. I want to be
Mm,
in person. I want to know you're paying attention. But I think that there was still a lot lost in there. And depending on the age, teenagers, I think had a lot of their socialization already done. And so they missed out on some big ticket things like maybe proms and graduations, but that's more fun stuff. But developmentally, if you were 5 and you were getting ready to go into kindergarten and
yeah.
you didn't get to go in for a few years, those are very developmentally important years from a social standpoint. And so we might be playing catch up related to that. But when everyone is kind of universally delayed, I'm not sure, but I think we're gonna start
Gonna
seeing more
find
of
out.
that. Yeah, we're gonna find out.
It is
Mhm.
very wild. I mean, like, it's so funny because I can't remember the timelines of when things came out versus when COVID happened and whatnot, but there are certain things that hit different now post COVID. And now it's like, even I don't know about you guys, but my brain kind of forgets COVID happened, which I don't even understand how the brain does that. But man, it adjusts to things and is like, new norm. Okay, forget everything else that happened. But there's just, it's so funny because I'll talk to like young adults and they'll talk about not really having a senior year for
Mhm.
example, or I don't know. There's just so many things I feel like when it comes to these big events that it's funny because Keeden, you were talking about how they do it big in the comics.
Mhm.
Life's been doing it big for the
Yeah,
past like 6 years, it feels like.
a lot.
So yeah, like you said, Sasha, it's I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, I worry for people who are young having to deal with all of these things, and yet there's resilience there.
Yeah,
And every generation has their stuff, I guess, that makes them
yeah,
unique in terms of how they are. So I guess it's not like good or bad. It's just what is.
Yeah. I think one thing that I've noticed, because, if anybody goes to the doctor, those people probably started medical school during COVID, or they were 1 year into medical school. And so I think that we're really at this place where we're starting to see, so maybe more of their clinicals were online. And so there was less of that interaction. But I think the one thing that I have learned is like we are very social creatures and we learn in that way. And the best learning is hands on. Because even with the trainees, that I work with from a psychology standpoint, like I can tell that we're in this weird space where much of their graduate school was completed in COVID. And so they didn't have, the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
interactions, Amelia, that you and I had in graduate school. And they were learning very, very kind of core competencies virtually, which I just can't wrap my head around. But it's very obvious, and there's some emerging patterns. I do psychology training. I've talked with psychiatrists. I've talked with pediatric residency trainings, and there's just some patterns that are emerging. And the only thing I can really lead it back to is COVID.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very interesting. Well, good luck training the next generation then.
Yes.
yes,
But you know what? They're going to have a unique experience that I feel like can really relate to the people they're going to be working
The
with. So
patients. Yeah.
hopefully it all balances out in
well,
some ways, but very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Keeden, any
absolutely.
last lingering questions on your end?
Honestly, I could. I'm. I'm not. I have dozens. However, we've been going for an hour now, and so I'm not going to keep you here all night. What
We
I
can
can
do
say
part
is,
two.
There you
yes,
go.
I would love that, and thank you so much for coming and hanging out with us tonight, teaching me so many things. But I also wanted to ask, is there anything like currently that you would like to make people aware of, like any events happening, anything you can share as far as resources or any promotions that you have, anything?
Gosh, I wasn't prepared for that. I mean,
I'm sorry.
no, you're good. I actually, Amelia outed me early on that I don't know a lot about superheroes, but I've really enjoyed the conversation because I think the one kind of emerging thing for me is acceptance of differences. And I think that that is something that, everybody can benefit from. We're all different. We bring different things to the table. We bring different skill sets. We bring different characteristics and experiences. And I think just how like everybody has something to contribute, and the superheroes have different things, but they're all contributing, and sometimes they come together as a group and sometimes they only come together because humanity is being threatened. But I think that that's actually really cool to then equate back to what we're doing. And I think really just being open and accepting of all different things is the best thing, including like mental health stuff, because there is so much stigma. And we see it, Amelia, I'm sure you see it as well, but like it just is like we're all just our experiences, and it shouldn't be a big deal to ask for help if it's challenging.
Well, thank you so much, Sasha. It's been really
Yeah,
nice having you on.
thank you.
So, yeah, once again, we really appreciate it. And yeah, we are going to keep you in mind if we have any other kid, adolescent, type stuff that we are wondering questions about. We'll have you on speed dial. Although I guess
Sounds
the
Yeah,
good.
kids don't call it that anymore. I don't even
yeah.
know what they.
When Disney finally decides to make Young Avengers, you'll be the first You'll be first on the phone.
There you go.
All right,
We'll make
sounds
you're
good.
gonna watch at least one superhero thing,
At least
and
one
I
of them.
will
you'll be
watch
prepped
it.
and ready. You can use
Yes.
it with all the kids you meet with. It'll be great.
Yes,
Excellent. Excellent.
I would love that. Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This was really a lot of fun, and I didn't know what to expect, so I appreciate it.
Thanks for nerding out with us. I'm clinical psychologist Dr. Amelia Brown.
And I'm educator and comic aficionado Keeden Hopkins. Check out my TV and movie reviews on YouTube at Team JVS. Check out our website at bat-therapy.com, our Bat Therapy YouTube channel, and follow us on social media. And don't forget our Patreon page at patreon.com/battherapy. See you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.